we're gonna start looking here at, again, where life has originated from. And there's a lot of different theories around this. Obviously for a long time in human history, it was believed in God or the creator or some supreme entity was responsible for it. There are theories of life arrived to Earth from meteorites. Life started as a single-celled organism somehow, and life just got created, and then it evolved from that point onward. So there's a lot of different theories around it. We're going to go over what we kind of know right now. So starting out here, so we know the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, basically. That said, it has not been livable for that time. When it was first formed, it was a bowl of, it was just lava. Not only that, we have to think about our atmosphere as well. What was the composition of the air? Because the planet was mostly lava, we had volcanoes, and volcanoes spew out stuff that will kill you if you breathe it, right? CO2, sulfur dioxide, and other things. These are all elements that make up our air. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, etc. The air is not pure oxygen. When the Earth and atmosphere were first formed, there was in fact no oxygen, or very little of it. So one thing we know is that all life, most life rather, does require oxygen to function. So it's almost a necessity. So when we start looking back in history, we start looking back at this crust, 4.5 billion years ago, we eventually will find fossils. And we will come back to fossils probably next week with Charles Darwin. You've probably all heard of him. So we know that a fossil it's preserved evidence of an organism. Or sometimes you can get fossils of poop, plants. You can sometimes get like germs and stuff within it as well. So almost every species that currently exists, think about how many tens of thousands of organisms that exist here. Hundreds of thousands, frankly, all the different bugs, plants, mammals, viruses, germs, bacteria. 99% of all of life is currently extinct. So we're only a small fraction. And of that 99%, only a tiny amount we find in the fossil record. Because it's pretty hard to make a fossil. There's a lot of circumstances that need to happen. So how do they form? So most fossils, not all, but most fossils are formed in a sedimentary rock. So what happens is basically animal dies, here we have a crocodile, and it gets covered up. So sediments kind of build up here. Dirt, minerals, etc., pile up on top of it. Basically, you don't expose it to air, is really what it boils down to. So what ends up is this ends up getting covered up, and then what's going to happen is we're going to get minerals that replace the organic matter. Has anyone here ever been to like the Regina museum with like the dinosaur skulls and stuff? The bones there, and they do have dinosaur bones. They do have fossils there. It's not bone, right? Like I think we've all seen like a deer carcass or something on the road after a couple of years. It's distinctly different. It's rock. Those fossils, those bones turn into rocks and minerals because it gets the organic material in it gets replaced by those minerals. And then what we're left with is, well, kind of a rock of its body. In really simple terms, we're left with an impression. So when we're looking at fossils, how do we date them? If I have two fossils, obviously they're old. How do I know which one's older? There's a couple of things that we use. One of them is we will look at something called relative dating. We look at the rocks within those layers. If it's found in this rock, and if I'm able to look all around the world and I see that, and everywhere in the world, I see this rock. And when that rock was formed, we think it was between 100 million years ago and 65 million years ago. I have some good data in them. So one is I look at where it's actually located. Another one is I could look at I could look at, what do I call it? How deep it is. Typically stuff that's deeper tends to be older because Earth just keeps on accumulated on top of it. That's one thing that we could do as well. And then another one, which is relatively new. This is relatively new technology. I think it's only a couple decades old. We look at radiometric dating. We look at the radioactivity, the half-life of certain things. There are certain elements that take so long to decompose that we can use that. We can look at what's in these fossils to determine, oh, well, this, the elements at this point of decay, that would indicate it's this many thousands or millions of years old. We use this by looking at something called radioactive isotopes. So we look at this and we look at, and we learn this from the half-life, which is basically how long does it take the original isotope to decay? Let's kind of ground that in reality. Caffeine. I like coffee. Most people like coffee or energy drinks or something. When you drink it, you get that little bit of energy boost, right? And then slowly what ends up happening is it ends up decaying over time. If you take an energy drink, let's say a Red Bull, 100 milligrams of caffeine, it's going to slowly tick away, 98, 97, 96, 95. Your body processes it. Once you get to 50 milligrams, you've reached the half-life of it. And we know that the half-life of caffeine is something like, I think it's 4 hours. So if I drink, at 5 p.m., I drink a Red Bull, I still have 50 milligrams of caffeine in my system 4 hours later. This is why they say, hey, you shouldn't drink caffeine after like noon or something like that. Because technically, again, if I take 100 milligrams at noon, 12, at 4 p.m., I'm at 50. At 8 p.m., I still got 25 milligrams in my body. So we use that exact same concept, but we just look at stuff that decays much slower, radioactive isotopes. So, so again, if we're kind of looking at this, how much of the C14 is left? If there's 100%, it seems like it was, it's 80% rather. It looks like the rock is almost 2,000 years old. If I want to, if I have a 20,000-year-old rock, I can see that I probably have about, looks like 10% of this isotope left. So this is one of the elements that we can do. There are several. So we're able to use this to date stuff like dinosaur poop. Again, if I go to these fossils, if I see this one here, oh, that's a T-Rex fossil. We know when the T-Rex lived, through a bunch of evidence. Generally it's now accepted that T-Rex has lived, I don't know the actual dates, 200 million years ago. I'm just picking a random number. But what if I find something's poop, right? I don't know where it came from. We can use this dating to establish that, oh, I think this drop-in is from this time period. Based on the size of it, maybe that's a T-Rex one. They could try and analyze it, what's the composition of it, etc. So what we do is if we take the Earth's history, and I just lay it in a line, right? The Earth is, so let's go, this is the universe. Let's imagine this is the universe's history. The universe is about 8 billion years old, is what they currently think, right? But the Earth was only formed here. The Earth was formed, we think, 4.6 billion years ago, right? When the dinosaurs were around, it was, maybe something like here, something like that. When life first emerged, maybe it was somewhere like here, like I think it was like 400 and some million years ago, etc. So this is what our time scale is. Now, if we look at just the Earth's part of it, this part here, we can kind of, we started to classify this. So we have a couple different eons, which aren't too important, but this is how it's classified. We know, currently we classify our stuff like days, years, months, decades. It's just like that system, just a much, much, much bigger scale. So epochs are when we are looking at 1 million years. We'll try and go down to 1 million years when we're looking at really old stuff, right? We classify things as periods. For example, during a Jurassic period, we might identify that, oh, the climate was quite warm here and quite humid. There was a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. That's about 10 million years. If we go even bigger to eras, the era of the dinosaurs, for example, we're looking at 100 million years. And then, of course, we have eons, which are anything bigger than 100 million years. So the eon is, well, the eon would be like the Earth's formation, for example. So let's start looking into, let's zoom into the scale here. We're going to ignore this part, right? I'm a big space nerd and I love this stuff, but it's not relevant to this class. So we're going to start with when the Earth was formed. So we're going to start looking at here at what's called the Precambrian period. This is the first 4 billion years. If you remember, this part right here, where I'm drawing that arrow to, this is when life first originated, right? There's all of this stuff here, though. Where the Earth was around, it existed, but there was no life that we've identified that existed during this time. So this period is called that Precambrian period. So it's most of it, right? It's 4 billion years. So life does appear at the end of this. Specifically, simple life. Again, when life first started here, it was very simple. We know that there's 2 kinds of cells. The first life that originated almost certainly was a single-celled organism. It was just a cell and that's it, floating around. And so it would have been a prokaryotic one, right? We know those are the simpler ones. So we first start with prokaryotic cells, probably ones that are autotrophic, right? Because remember, I can have an autotrophic, I make my own food, or I can have a heterotrophic where I eat something to get my food, right? I get my energy. There's nothing for that to eat. That's the first thing of life, right? So what does it have to do? It has to generate its own energy. So we start with the most simple-celled organism that makes its own food. Awesome. And then slowly, over millions of years, we eventually get multicellular organisms, and we get eukaryotic cells, which eventually will turn to animals. So let's zoom in here. Now we have life. Awesome. So right now we are here. We've developed life. Now we're going to look at the rest of this stuff here. So now we're going to the Paleozoic era. So we go from the Precambrian era to the Paleozoic one. So if we think about, we'll learn more about this, but we started with a single-celled organism up here, right? And then slowly it kept on evolving into something new. Now we have a eukaryotic cell, and then eventually, maybe we get an animal or something. Does anyone know where all life on land originated from? What ancestor that came from? If humans came from, like, I guess, monkey family, all land on life came from, there was a lizard that was kind of coming out of the water. I'm simplifying it, but there was something that came out of the water and it could survive up here for a little bit. So from that, let's imagine this is my lizard here. I'm going to box that. What do we have now? We have millions of species currently that live on land, right? Think about bugs and all, and mammals and reptiles, plants, etc. So what happened? Boom, we get an explosion of genetic variety. We eventually emerge new species from this. So we call this the Cambrian explosion. This is just one example, right? There's more animals than just the one that came onto the Earth, for example, right? We have plants, we have things that live in the water, we have germs, we have things that live in the air, etc. So throughout all of this, most of the major animal groups diversified. So that's what we call this Cambrian explosion, and this is when that first life emerged. So what ends up happening now, does anyone know how many mass extinctions there were? You might have seen this on like a YouTube or a TikTok or something. Can anyone think of one that happened? Meteor came to Earth, boom, wiped out the dinosaurs. That's one of these extinctions. We've had many of them. I think, if I'm recalling off the top of my head, I think we've had 5 mass extinctions. So during the first mass extinction in this era, most of the marine animals died. Most of the animals in the ocean died. My understanding of it is that the water just became so tainted with like acidification, similar to what we're seeing with coral reefs right now, just to a much higher degree, that they died. Cool. So what ends up happening? Explosion of life, bunch of them die. What's going to happen? We're going to reset the cycle. So now we're going to go into the Mesozoic era. And what do we see here? Jurassic Park, right? We see dinosaurs. So this is when we start to see much more complex and larger life. This is when we see dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. Oh yeah, so obviously we know what happens to the dinosaurs. They die, right? They get wiped out. They get extinct in a very fast amount of time. The thing that we believe did that was, of course, a meteorite, right? We had a giant meteorite about 12 kilometers in diameter strike the Earth. Caused a whole bunch of things, yada, yada, yada. But eventually, you know, most life on Earth dies. Not all of it, but most does. So we can usually identify if something came from this time period, if something died from specifically this meteorite, because that meteorite was filled with a mineral called iridium, sorry. It's very rare. It's a giant meteorite. It's coming in super quickly. It smashes the Earth. What happens to this rock? It explodes. The dust goes everywhere, all over the world, right? This is largely what killed it. It wasn't the explosion that killed most life on Earth. It was the fact that all this dust and debris goes up into the air, blocks out the sun, creates an ice age. So eventually all that stuff falls back to the Earth, right? So now we have a really thin layer of this iridium, this really rare mineral that all deposited around the Earth at the same time. So now if I'm looking at the soil and I see, oh, I found a fossil. It's right beside this soil that has this. What probably killed it? Big giant meteor. So this was, of course, a really long era. So this is still the same area. It's Mesozoic area. It started 225 million years ago, and the meteor hit the Earth 65 million years ago. So that was 160 million years. So 160 million years is how long this lasted. And the Earth itself changed shape during this, right? We know about plate tectonics. We know that, you know, these move a couple centimeters a year and stuff. That's what causes earthquakes, etc. Over 160 million of those, you know, just moves 1 or 2 centimeters a year. That's a lot of distance over time. So that's where we start to get our more modern continents from. You can already tell, like, this is Africa, this is Australia, this is Europe, North America, South America, etc. But originally it was all at some point a condensed landmass that touched. So what we have here, and this is going to set the foundation for where a lot of stuff, where modern evolution takes place, is let's put this together. I have 160 million years where I have lots of complex life that can survive. Big life, small life. I have lots of life, and I'm scattered all throughout a giant continent. What ends up happening is slowly over 160 million years, this continent drifts apart. Now what I've done is I have isolated all these really big and unique creatures to 65 million years ago. So now is when we can start to see a lot of this regional evolution start to take place as these plates start to move. So, which kind of brings us to our next area. You know, asteroid hits the Earth, everything dies. What do? We start again. That's a pretty common theme here. Something wipes out life, life starts again. We go till the next extinction, which brings us to our next area, our Cenozoic era. So this is our third era with life. So mammals start to become the dominant land animals. And after this, mammals started to diversify. So this is when we started to see mammals diversify. Dinosaurs were not quite mammals. Mammals have their own characteristics. So once these die, we start to see the mammals themselves start to change. And humans begin to appear in what's called the Neogeon period of this era. Because remember, periods are, you know, if this is an era here, a period could be just this section of the era, for example. And that's it. That's kind of this part for now. So we've set this foundation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what actually created life. So cool, that's a brief snapshot of everything. But what itself actually created life? What was the origin of life? Because we try this a lot. Scientists try this a lot. Scientists keep trying to make life. We know the ingredients we need. Think about like a cake, right? I know I need flour, water, eggs, vanilla, baking soda. I know these are all things that were around when the first cake was ever baked. But every time I mix them together, I'm not getting my cake. I'm doing something wrong. There's some special ingredient that we are missing that we don't know what it was. We still don't know what was the incident that created the very first life form. Again, there's a reason why some people think that life first came from meteorites. We don't know. So we're just going to do what our best possible. We're going to go through some of the theories of it. So what actually created life on Earth? If life started on Earth and you don't believe in, some type of a god or a higher being, just, yeah, life now exists. What did it? Some type of a chemical reaction. Something chemically happened. And with that, some stroke of luck, something happened, and we get that first single-celled organism that emerges. So let's start looking at this. So what I just talked about, again, think about it. I have all these ingredients for a cake, and somehow I get a cake. This is what's called spontaneous generation. If I have all these ingredients that can make life, oxygen, carbon, I have a warm environment. It's in water, for example. I have all these chemicals and molecules that we know are necessary for life. They're all just sitting and floating in the sea. At some point, something happened and life emerges. This is spontaneous generation. Life arises from non-life. So this is one of the really early ideas. If we take this and we apply this to, let's apply this to what humans think though, early humans. Some people think that the worms and the insects and fish arose from mud, and then flies come from rotten meat. What we know is flies don't just crawl out of meat, right? If I leave meat there, the flies don't come from within the meat. What we know now is what happens. The flies get attracted to the meat. So flies themselves aren't created from rotten meat. Worms aren't created from mud. We just see worms in mud. We see flies on rotten meat. That's different, right? So this was, early human superstition, early human belief. We know that isn't true though now. So we eventually get to something called the theory of biogenesis, which is, okay, you can only get life from other life. And generally speaking, that's true. You can only get life from life, except for that very first thing that popped up. Again, that's still the big question, right? So theory of biogenesis, you can only get life from life. So these are still early ideas. We know that it's more complicated than this. So let's go to what we think now. So one thing is we think simple organic molecule formation. Basically, what most biologists believe is that life started through some type of a chemical event. Again, I have all these necessary things for life that are happening at the same time, and something chemical happened, and I get that first cell that emerges. We call this a primordial soup, is what they kind of call this. So the primordial soup hypothesis. Again, basically, we have a certain amount of gases, we have water, we have the right temperature, blah, 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 a bunch of things. Some type of organic molecule, life, gets created. They think that perhaps the sun could have served as an energy source for these. Again, precursors of life. There's nothing for them to eat when life first gets created. They have to generate their own energy sometime. So this is still the same idea, simple organic molecule formation. So what did they do? They took a couple of inorganic things. So if we think about this, what's the difference between an organic molecule and an inorganic molecule? Organic molecules are something that we have found in life that we believe is a necessary ingredient for life. Inorganic ones are things that you can't build life off of. I can't build life out of plastic, for example, but I can build life out of carbon. Every living creature on Earth today, any dead creature ever on Earth, we have discovered that we've ever found was a carbon-based life form. So carbon's an organic molecule, for example. So we have two scientists, Miller and Urey. They took inorganic compounds and they used it to create organic compounds, stuff like amino acids, for example, proteins. Remember that whole thing where the ribosome's reading this genetic code? It's spitting out amino acids and proteins necessary for life. We also found that the precursor to nucleic bases could be formed from even simpler molecules. Again, we know that all life, all DNA rather, again, are those, those A, T, C, and G's. Those are nucleic acids, right? Those are organic necessary ingredients for life. But I can create this through other things, is what we discovered. So I can create this, from, I don't know, two different other elements, for example, under the right conditions. Okay, well, this leads some credence to this theory, right? Maybe there was a chemical reaction that did this. So why is this important? Why is this nucleic acid thing important? Well, life requires proteins and amino acids. So how do you create proteins? Just because this creates amino acids doesn't mean it's created proteins, which are necessary for life. So how do we do this? Well, if we take these amino acids and if they're attached to a clay particle, we are able to actually create a protein off of that. It kind of serves as a weird base for it. And we know that there was lots of this in the early ocean. So again, why have we spent so much time learning about RNA and nucleotides and all this stuff like this? Because we consider RNA to have been the first ingredient for life. RNA, again, we know what RNA is, right? We know that it carries enzymes, it goes through ribosomes, all the stuff like that. It's the ingredients to eventually create proteins. We think that this may have been what carried out the life process. So somehow, this clay could have served as a way to create more DNA and RNA out of, is one of the hypotheses. I don't fully understand how, that's above my pay grade, but that's just one of the theories that we have. So eventually we end up going into formation of cells, but basically we get a membrane. Again, a cell, imagine this is a cell here. I have this cell membrane, right? I have this to protect myself. Remember that cell permeability where I can take stuff in, but I can also spit stuff out? Cell membranes are vital to life. It's a necessity. So how do you create a cell membrane? Again, that had to form through something. So we don't know. It's really what it is. We don't know. It's not 100% certain. Again, this is not fully fleshed out yet. But we know that somehow these cell membranes eventually were formed. And they think it could have been because of, again, some type of a chemical event that created it. Just like these nucleotides got created from smaller things, maybe cell membranes got created from smaller things as well. So let's actually go into, again, this is all just to say, to summarize, we think we know what kind of caused it, but we're not 100% sure. Again, we're missing a key ingredient in this cake mix. We don't know what temperature the oven was on. We don't know what pan it was poured in. Think about it like that. We have a pretty good idea, but there's still some unknowns that we might not ever know. But anyways, long story short, what ends up happening? I put all this stuff in a bowl. Eventually, I get a cake. I get my first life form. So the first cells. So we get the first life form, a single-celled organism. The first life form was 100% a single-celled organism because it's the simplest form. So again, if life starts simple and it starts as single cellular, it's going to be prokaryotic. Those are those simple cells, if you recall. So many of these prokaryotes, of these cells, are found in extreme environments that are still similar to early Earth. We have found life. There's underground volcano vents, right? We have found life that thrives in that. Several hundreds of degrees, like 300 degrees Celsius, and life is living there. You know, that's not unsimilar to how it was. And not only is it living there, again, what's coming out of that volcanic vent? All these gases that we consider quite harmful to us, sulfur, carbon dioxide, stuff like that. Well, we find cells even today living there. So this kind of leads some credence to this. Well, if life, you know, if we have these simple cells who can survive in those conditions today, well, we can kind of create what similar conditions were like back then, 500 million years ago. That seems fair. So what we know, so first off, early Earth lacked oxygen. We had very little or no oxygen until relatively recently in our history. We also know, we have found something called cyanobacteria. We found this shortly after we think life was kind of created. These are photosynthesizing. Remember, these are autotrophs. They make their own food. So eventually, if you guys remember, we have this cell cycle with photosynthesis, right? Do you remember what ingredients go in? Obviously, sunlight. There was also water. Did anyone remember what gas it intakes as well? And carbon dioxide, CO2. So I put these three things into a plant. It goes through photosynthesis, yada, yada. What does it do? It creates energy, it creates that ATP, all that stuff. But what does it also spit out? What do plants spit out? Oxygen. So what ends up happening is, cool, I have photosynthesizing life forms. We know that, I have photosynthesizing life forms that were created. And if they're going through photosynthesis, what's happening? They're taking in all this stuff. They have sunlight. They're sitting in an ocean. There's so much CO2 because there's so many volcanoes everywhere. It sucks all this in. It goes through photosynthesis and it spits out oxygen. Over time, over a very long period of time, literally billions of years, this eventually creates enough oxygen for other life to emerge. So eventually, there's enough oxygen to support an ozone layer, which gives us some protection, and also create enough oxygen for larger life forms. So where do we get eukaryotics? This is all prokaryotics. Where do I get those eukaryotic cells? One theory, the endosymbiotic theory. Basically, we think there's eukaryotic cells and they absorb these prokaryotic ones, which eventually turn to organs. So think about it like a giant box. I have a box here, and I'm going to put a couple of eukaryotic cells in there. So what they think is this is what happened. I have a shell, I have a couple of prokaryotics here, and these eventually will evolve into organs, or organelles, rather. So how come this would do this? Well, these prokaryotic cells in here would enter it as undigested food. It was originally thought, maybe it's preying on it. But eventually it becomes beneficial, right? I help you, you help me. And so this is where they think that organelles and more complex life started to emerge from. And that's it. That's kind of it. So where have we kind of left off here, learning all this? All we've really gotten to now is we have gotten to, hey, we have multicellular life. That's it. Now we eventually know where this story ends. We know that, what we think now, what's almost universally agreed on is, hey, evolution. Evolution's the thing. So we're going to eventually learn about that. How do we go from this multicellular organism to us. That's the rest of the history that we're kind of focused on here. So now we're going to zoom in a little bit. Okay, so just to kind of start out here, like I said, we are moving really quickly. That was less than an hour. That's the section. I'll give you guys some time here to head to this. What I recommend you do though is use your book. You have an infinite amount of time. I think what's going to happen is I'll give you guys till about 2:30 to try out this history of life quiz. There was a section I bypassed. No, there was not a section that I bypassed in here. Wait, no, there was not. Okay. So I will give you guys about an hour here to try out just this quiz here. Use your textbook for that. I apologize, but we do have to move quickly because there's just stuff we got to get through.